Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving into something that is essential for any English language learner, no matter where you are on your journey.
Setting effective goals.
Yes, setting effective goals. And we are going to be unpacking a fantastic episode from the English Unlocked podcast, which is all about, well, just that.
And you know what's so fascinating about this is it's not just about, listing things you want to achieve.
Right.
This is about creating a roadmap that can truly unlock your potential in English.
Okay, so let's talk about that roadmap idea.
Yeah.
The English Unlocked hosts were really big on this idea that goals give you direction. And I'm curious, beyond just direction, what are some of the other less obvious benefits of setting goals when it comes to learning English?
Well, it's interesting because goals not only give you a sense of direction, like you said, but they also act as a sort of motivation booster.
Yeah.
When you see yourself making progress towards a specific target, it reinforces that sense of accomplishment and keeps you going,
Right.
especially when the going gets tough.
Totally makes sense. It's like those small wins along the way keep you energized and focused on the bigger picture.
Absolutely. And speaking of those small wins, the podcast really emphasizes this idea of celebrating milestones. It's so easy to just get caught up in what we haven't achieved yet.
Yeah.
But pausing to acknowledge how far we've come is crucial for staying motivated.
I've always struggled with sticking to deadlines. I set them with the best of intentions, but then life gets in the way.
Yeah.
Did the podcast offer any advice on how to make deadlines work for you rather than against you?
One of the most insightful things that I took away from the podcast was the emphasis on using the SMART framework for goals. Have you heard of that before?
I've heard of it, but to be honest, I've never really applied it to language learning.
Well, it stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Okay.
And it can be a game changer. So let's break it down a bit.
That would be great. It sounds incredibly useful, but I think having some concrete examples would really help it sink in.
Absolutely. So let's start with specific. Instead of saying, I want to improve my English speaking, a SMART goal would be something like, I want to confidently hold a 5-minute conversation with a native English speaker about my hobbies within 3 months. You see how much more focused and actionable that is.
Wow. That's a huge difference. I can already see how that kind of clarity would make a goal much easier to, actually achieve.
Exactly. And that brings us to measurable. You need a way to track your progress so you can see if you're on track to reach your goal.
Right.
In this case, you could track how long you can converse, the complexity of the topics you can discuss, or even the number of times you practice speaking each week.
So it's not just about the end goal. It's about those smaller steps along the way.
Precisely. And that's where achievable comes in.
Okay.
We've all been there. That initial burst of enthusiasm leads us to set our sights way too high.
Yes.
But that can set us up for disappointment if we don't see results quickly enough. It's much better to start with smaller, more manageable goals and build up from there.
So instead of aiming to speak fluently right away, a more achievable first goal might be to comfortably order food in English at a restaurant.
Exactly. Or maybe it's being able to understand the main points of an English language news article. Once you've mastered those smaller goals, you can set a new, slightly more challenging one.
This is starting to feel a lot less overwhelming.
Yeah.
I love that the podcast provided such practical strategies. It feels like something anyone can implement right away.
And that's the beauty of the SMART framework. It's not just a theory. It's a practical tool you can use to make real progress. But we've only covered the first 3 letters. Let's move on to relevant now.
Okay, so how do we make sure our goals are relevant to our overall language learning journey?
That's a great question. It means aligning your goals with your broader reasons for learning English.
Okay.
For example, if you're learning English to travel, your goals should focus on vocabulary and phrases related to travel situations like asking for directions or booking a hotel.
So if I wanted to say apply for a job that requires English, I should probably prioritize goals that involve improving my professional vocabulary and writing skills.
Yeah, exactly. Making your goals relevant to your personal motivations keeps them meaningful and helps you stay focused.
Yeah.
It also prevents you from wasting time on things that won't actually benefit you in the long run.
That's so important. It's like having a destination in mind before you start a road trip.
I love that analogy. It perfectly captures the essence of relevance when it comes to goal setting. And speaking of road trips, the last letter in SMART is time-bound, which is all about setting those deadlines we talked about earlier.
All right, let's talk deadlines. I'm ready to hear those tips for actually making them work for me instead of just stressing me out.
So when it comes to deadlines, It's about creating that sense of urgency without overwhelming yourself. It's like, okay, I
Yeah.
have this much time to reach this milestone.
Okay, I'm listening. What are some strategies for actually sticking to those deadlines and not just letting them fly by?
Well, one thing the podcast recommended was breaking down larger goals into smaller chunks with their own mini deadlines.
Okay.
So instead of just saying, I want to be fluent in 6 months, you could set smaller goals like, by next month, I want to be able to understand a basic English conversation without subtitles.
That's smart.
Yeah.
Smaller deadlines feel a lot less daunting than one giant looming one.
Right. And it gives you a sense of progress and accomplishment along the way. Another tip they mentioned was to actually write down your deadlines, not just keep them in your head.
Yeah.
Put them in your calendar, on a sticky note, wherever you'll see them regularly.
Oh, I'm a big fan of visual reminders. I have sticky notes everywhere. But what about those moments where you feel like you're falling behind on a deadline? I know I tend to get discouraged and just want to give up.
That's completely understandable. The podcast highlighted the importance of flexibility and self-compassion. If you miss a deadline, don't beat yourself up about it.
Yeah.
Instead, reassess, adjust the deadline if needed, and focus on getting back on track.
So it's all about that growth mindset, right? Learning from those setbacks instead of letting them derail you completely.
Exactly. It's about viewing those so-called failures as opportunities to learn and adjust your approach. Now, I know we've talked a lot about goal setting in a very structured way, but there's another element that's equally important: mindset.
Oh, mindset. That feels huge. I can see how having the right mindset would make a big difference, but how do you actually cultivate that positive, I can do this attitude, especially when you're feeling stuck or discouraged?
Well, the English Unlocked hosts emphasize the power of visualization. Imagine yourself achieving your goals, picture yourself confidently speaking English, and really tap into the emotions associated with that success.
So it's like creating a mental movie of yourself achieving fluency and using that to fuel your motivation.
Precisely. It might sound a bit woo-woo, but research has shown that visualization can actually rewire your brain to make success more likely. And the other thing they mentioned is celebrating those wins no matter how small.
That's a good reminder. It's easy to get so fixated on the end goal that we forget to acknowledge those little victories along the way.
Absolutely. Did you know that even simple things like using a new English phrase in a conversation or reading an entire article without needing a dictionary are worth celebrating? Those small wins build momentum and reinforce the belief that you are capable of achieving your language goals.
You're right. Sometimes I get so caught up in what I still can't do that I forget to acknowledge how far I've already come.
It's a common trap, but it's something to be mindful of. And speaking of things to be mindful of, the English Unlocked hosts also talked about some common mistakes to avoid when setting language learning goals.
Oh, like what? I'm all ears because I'm sure I've made my fair share of those mistakes.
Well, one of the biggest pitfalls they mentioned is being too vague with your goals.
Okay.
It's that whole I want to be better at English thing we discussed earlier.
Right. Without that specific roadmap, it's easy to get lost along the way.
Exactly. And another common mistake is setting unrealistic goals. Like, I'm going to become fluent in a month, which, let's be honest, is highly unlikely unless you're some kind of language savant.
Okay, so I've definitely been guilty of both of those. Anything else we should watch out for?
Another trap is neglecting to track your progress. It's like going on a road trip without a map or GPS. You might be moving, but you have no idea if you're heading in the right direction.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap?
The podcast suggested using a journal, a language learning app, or even a simple spreadsheet to keep track of your goals, deadlines, and progress. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but having a system for monitoring your journey is key.
I can see how that would make a huge difference in staying motivated and focused. It's like having a tangible record of your growth and accomplishments.
Precisely. And that sense of progress can be incredibly motivating. It's a reminder that you are moving forward, even if it doesn't always feel that way.
So let me ask you this. What if someone is feeling overwhelmed by the whole goal-setting process? Any advice for simplifying things and making it feel less daunting?
Well, that's a great question, and it's something that the English Unlocked team addressed directly. They suggested starting with just 1 or 2 small, manageable goals. It's about taking baby steps rather than trying to overhaul everything at once.
So quality over quantity when it comes to setting those initial goals. I like that approach.
Exactly. And remember, you can always adjust your goals along the way. As you gain confidence and momentum, you can gradually increase the challenge.
That makes me think of something we discussed earlier about those different levels of fluency. I know it's mentioned in the English Unlocked episode, but I'm Still a bit fuzzy on what that actually means. Could you elaborate a little on those different levels and how they might influence someone's goals?
Yeah, fluency isn't just a one-size-fits-all concept. It really depends on your individual goals and the context in which you'll be using English. For example, conversational fluency might mean you can comfortably chat with a friend about your day, while professional fluency might involve giving a presentation or negotiating a business deal in English.
So someone who's learning English to travel might have a different definition of fluency than someone who's learning it for work.
Precisely. It's all about aligning your definition of fluency with your personal language goals. And that's why setting those specific relevant goals is so crucial. It helps you focus on developing the skills and vocabulary that are most relevant to your needs.
Okay, that's making a lot more sense now. I think one of the things I personally struggle with is the fear of making mistakes. It can be so paralyzing. Did the English Unlocked podcast offer any advice for overcoming that fear?
They actually dedicated a whole segment to that. One of their key messages was to reframe mistakes as opportunities for growth. They encouraged listeners to view themselves as language explorers, constantly experimenting and learning from their missteps.
That's such a helpful shift in perspective. Instead of seeing mistakes as failures, they become stepping stones on the path to fluency.
Exactly. And they also emphasize the importance of creating a supportive learning environment for yourself. Surround yourself with people who encourage you and celebrate your progress rather than those who criticize or make you feel self-conscious.
That's so true. Having a supportive community can make a world of difference. And speaking of support, I think it's worth mentioning that there are tons of amazing resources available to English language learners beyond just this podcast. Did the English Unlocked team recommend any specific resources?
Oh, absolutely. They highlighted the importance of finding resources that align with your learning style and goals. They mentioned language exchange apps where you can connect with native speakers, online forums where you can practice your writing and get feedback, and even websites that offer personalized lesson plans based on your interests.
So it's really about finding the tools and approaches that work best for you rather than trying to follow a one-size-fits-all path.
Exactly. There's no right or wrong way to learn English as long as you're actively engaging with the language and consistently working toward your goals.
This entire conversation has been incredibly insightful. I feel like I have a much clearer understanding of how to set effective language learning goals, and I'm already feeling more motivated.
That's fantastic to hear. Remember, setting goals is just the first step. The real magic happens when you start putting those goals into action and consistently working towards them.
So true. And speaking of putting things into action, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question inspired by that road trip analogy we talked about earlier. If learning English is your journey, what's your destination? What exciting landmarks are you aiming for? And what steps can you take today to start moving towards those goals? Remember, every journey begins with a single step.
And the most important thing is to enjoy the ride. Learning a new language is an incredible adventure filled with discoveries, challenges, and rewards. So embrace the journey and celebrate every milestone along the way.